Pedro Alonso López, later known to the world as the Monster of the Andes, was born on October 8, 1948, in Colombia's Tolima department. His early life was marked by poverty, instability, and neglect. Accounts of his childhood suggest that he endured trauma and abuse, circumstances that would form the backdrop to the chilling path he eventually followed. Though details of these early years are sometimes contradictory or colored by myth, what emerges consistently is the image of a boy who grew up at the margins of society, invisible to most, and without the stabilizing structures that could have altered his trajectory. By the time he reached adolescence and early adulthood, he was already known to authorities for criminal activity. In 1969, he was convicted of auto theft in Colombia, a crime that led to imprisonment. Reports later indicated that his time in prison was not only formative, but brutal. He was reportedly assaulted by fellow inmates, an experience that hardened him further, and according to some accounts, deepened his resentment and violent impulses. By the time he was released in 1978, after nearly a decade of incarceration, López had entered the wider world as a man shaped by violence and isolation, ready to unleash destruction on a scale few could imagine. The Andean region into which López re-emerged in the late 1970s was itself a landscape marked by vulnerability. Poverty was widespread, particularly in rural and indigenous communities. Families struggled to survive, and children were often left unsupervised in marketplaces, bus terminals, or along rural roads, making them easy targets for exploitation. Displacement caused by economic hardship and political instability further compounded this vulnerability. The Andes offered López not only anonymity in its sprawling geography, but also an endless supply of potential victims who were overlooked by systems of power. Law enforcement was fragmented, under-resourced, and poorly coordinated across national borders. Missing children's cases were rarely pursued with urgency, and there was no centralized infrastructure to track patterns of abductions. This environment created the conditions in which a predator could operate freely, moving between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru with impunity. López's crimes began to take shape in Peru, where he allegedly attempted to abduct a young girl in Ayacucho. Accounts suggest that villagers captured him in the act and initially intended to kill him. Intervention by a missionary spared his life, and authorities expelled him rather than pursuing charges. The decision to release him instead of prosecuting him proved catastrophic. It was a moment of missed justice that allowed him to continue his predatory path unchecked. From Peru, López drifted into Ecuador, where he would commit many of the murders for which he later became infamous. By the late 1970s, towns across Ecuador began noticing the disappearance of young girls, yet the disappearances were treated as isolated tragedies rather than recognized as part of a horrific pattern. Many of the children came from poor or indigenous families, and their cases did not command the attention of authorities. In this climate of neglect, López refined his methods, approaching children in crowded public spaces, offering small gifts or coins, and luring them away. Once isolated, he committed his crimes and buried the bodies in shallow graves. Each disappearance looked like a local tragedy, and without systems to connect the dots, the larger pattern went unnoticed. Everything changed in 1980 in the city of Ambato, Ecuador, when two events converged to expose López. Heavy rains caused floods along the Rio Ambato, dislodging shallow graves and exposing the bodies of missing girls. The shocking sight confirmed community suspicions that something far more sinister was occurring than a series of isolated disappearances. Around the same time, López attempted to abduct a young girl in a crowded marketplace. This time, vigilant vendors intervened, subduing him and delivering him to the police. Unlike previous occasions, where luck or expulsion had allowed him to escape consequences, in Ambato both natural forces and human vigilance combined to bring him to justice. The arrest was a turning point, not just in his story, but in how societies across the Andes began to confront the vulnerability of their children. When first detained, López refused to cooperate with investigators. His confessions came only after an unusual strategy was employed by Ecuadorian police captain Pastor Cordova, who posed as a fellow prisoner in order to gain López's trust. Over time, López began to boast of his crimes, speaking of hundreds of children murdered across 3 countries. His words might have been dismissed as delusions of grandeur, but then he began leading investigators to burial sites. The remains of young girls were discovered exactly where he said they would be, corroborating his confessions. In Ecuador alone, police tied him to at least 110 murders. López claimed responsibility for more than 300 killings across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. But only the Ecuadorian cases could be confirmed with forensic or circumstantial evidence. These discoveries marked the moment when suspicion hardened into certainty. The disappearances that had haunted families and towns for years were not isolated incidents, but the work of a single predator who had exploited every weakness of the societies he moved through. López's arrest in Ambato thus stands as one of the most significant moments in Latin American criminal history. It was not police investigation or state intelligence that exposed him, but the convergence of chance, a flood revealing hidden bodies, and the vigilance of ordinary citizens in a crowded marketplace. His case underscores the fragility of institutional responses to crime in contexts of poverty and weak governance, and it set the stage for debates that continue to this day about how justice systems should respond to atrocity-level individual crimes. After his release from prison in Colombia in 1978, Pedro Alonso López drifted southward into Peru, where his cycle of violence began to take shape. In the highland city of Ayacucho, he was reportedly caught trying to abduct a young girl. Villagers, recognizing the danger, seized him, and there are accounts that they planned to execute him on the spot. Intervention by a missionary spared his life, but instead of being prosecuted, he was simply expelled from the community and left to continue on his way. This episode represented a tragic turning point, a missed opportunity to stop him before his spree claimed hundreds of lives. The failure of authorities to pursue justice allowed him to move across the Andes, leaving behind broken families and communities. By 1979, López was in Ecuador, and the pattern of disappearances that followed revealed his predatory focus. In towns such as Ambato, Riobamba, and Quito, families began reporting missing girls, nearly all of them between the ages of 8 and 12. For many, the disappearances seemed like personal tragedies. Perhaps a child had wandered away. Perhaps she had been lost in the currents of displacement that marked the era. Authorities tended to treat them as isolated cases. But as the months passed, the numbers grew too large to dismiss, and a climate of unease began to take hold. Parents started escorting their daughters everywhere, while vendors in markets began to notice strangers lingering around stalls, watching children with a predatory eye. López exploited the chaos and anonymity of these busy spaces. He would approach children with promises of sweets or coins, lure them away, and take them to isolated locations where he carried out his crimes. The city of Ambato became the epicenter of events in 1980, when 2 separate developments converged to finally reveal the horror of what had been happening. Torrential rains caused the Rio Ambato to flood, exposing shallow graves along its banks. The bodies of young girls previously hidden from sight surfaced in the muddy waters. The discovery was shocking and undeniable. Something systematic and horrific was occurring. Around the same time, López attempted to lure another child away from a marketplace in broad daylight. This time, however, he was noticed by vigilant vendors and bystanders. Unlike in Ayacucho years earlier, the community did not let him slip away. They seized him and delivered him to the police. The convergence of natural disaster and community vigilance brought him into custody at the very moment evidence of his crimes was literally being uncovered by the elements. Once arrested, López initially refused to speak. The breakthrough came when Ecuadorian police captain Pastor Córdoba posed as a fellow prisoner in order to earn his trust. Slowly, López began to talk, and then to boast. He confessed to the murders of hundreds of children across 3 countries and described his methods with chilling detachment. What transformed his confessions from mere words into undeniable evidence was his ability to lead investigators to specific sites where the remains of girls were buried. In location after location, shallow graves yielded bones, clothing, and personal belongings that matched the accounts of families who had reported their daughters missing. In Ecuador alone, investigators were able to confirm his responsibility for the deaths of 110 girls. The scale of the discovery stunned the nation and the world, and López himself continued to insist that the true number of victims exceeded 300. The methods available to investigators in 1980 were limited compared to modern forensic science. There were no DNA tests, no centralized databases, and no sophisticated forensic anthropology teams. Instead, investigators relied on the tangible markers of memory and loss: shoes recognized by grieving parents, dresses identified by mothers, small possessions that families clutched as proof of identity. Police also noted the consistency of the cases. All of the girls fell within a narrow age range. All had disappeared from public spaces, and all had been killed in the same way. The evidence was circumstantial by modern standards, but the confessions, combined with the physical discoveries, left little room for doubt. Although Ecuador became the country where López was prosecuted and convicted, his claims implicated Colombia and Peru as well. In Colombia, his home country, reports of missing girls were often lost amid the chaos of armed conflict and rural displacement. Families searching for their daughters were frequently met with indifference from authorities. In Peru, the decision to expel him rather than pursue prosecution became a haunting example of state failure. The strongest evidence lay in Ecuador, and it was there that the judicial process unfolded. While in neighboring nations, his crimes remained unresolved suspicions, fragments of grief without closure. International journalists soon converged on Ambato, and the world learned of the monster of the Andes. The narrative was shocking, not only because of the numbers involved, but also because of what it revealed about social and institutional fragility. López had thrived in environments where poverty and neglect left children exposed, where borders were porous, and where policing was weak. He had been stopped not by careful investigation, but by the courage of ordinary citizens and the chance intervention of nature. Ambato became infamous, remembered both as the city where the crimes were exposed and the place where justice, however limited, began to take shape. When Pedro Alonso López was finally brought before the courts in Ecuador in 1980, the justice system faced an unprecedented challenge. The evidence against him was overwhelming in scale, yet the legal framework of the country was not designed to contend with crimes of such magnitude. Prosecutors built their case primarily around his confessions, the remains unearthed at sites he identified, and the testimonies of families who recognized clothing and possessions recovered from the shallow graves. It was not the kind of forensic case that would satisfy the rigor of modern DNA evidence, but in the context of the time, it was enough to convict. The sheer consistency of the accounts, the age of the victims, the circumstances of their disappearances, the manner of their deaths established a pattern that could not be ignored. Still, there was a profound tension between the enormity of the crimes and the capacity of Ecuador's penal system to respond. The law at the time set a maximum penalty of only 16 years in prison, even for the most egregious offenses. This was the same sentence one might receive for a single homicide, and it applied regardless of whether the accused had taken one life or hundreds. For families and for the public, the thought that a man who confessed to killing more than 300 children might serve less than 2 decades behind bars was unthinkable. Yet the judges had no choice but to apply the law as it stood. In 1980, López was sentenced to 16 years, the maximum permitted under Ecuadorian law. Inside Quito's Garcia Moreno prison, López cultivated an image of calm and compliance. He reportedly behaved as a model inmate, avoiding conflict and presenting himself as rehabilitated. This behavior did not stem from remorse, but rather from calculation. Observers later noted how his demeanor reflected classic traits of psychopathy: charm, manipulation, and an absence of genuine empathy. As the years passed, his sentence ran its course, and in 1994 he was released 2 years early for so-called good behavior. At the time of his release, he gave an interview in which he boasted of being the man of the century, an arrogant statement that underscored his lack of contrition and his fascination with notoriety. Ecuador, having exhausted its legal authority over him, deported López to Colombia. There, authorities attempted to detain him and bring new charges related to crimes he had committed in his home country. Yet the challenges of prosecuting him were immense. Many of the disappearances dated back more than a decade, in a country already overwhelmed by political violence and internal conflict. Records were incomplete, evidence was scarce, and witnesses were scattered or gone. In the end, a Colombian court deemed López mentally unfit to stand trial and confined him to a psychiatric hospital. In a decision that would later haunt the authorities, doctors declared him sane in 1998, and he was released on bail under the condition that he report periodically to the police. Almost immediately, he vanished. His last confirmed sighting occurred in 1999, when he attempted to renew his identification papers. After that, he slipped back into the shadows, and his whereabouts remain unknown. The international reaction to López's release was one of horror and disbelief. To many outside Ecuador, it seemed inconceivable that a man linked to over 100 confirmed murders could serve only 14 years before being set free. The case became a flashpoint for criticism of Ecuador's sentencing laws and a broader discussion about how societies should handle serial offenders whose crimes defy the normal boundaries of justice. The story attracted further controversy when Guinness World Records briefly listed López as the most prolific serial killer, based on his own claims of more than 300 victims. Public outrage eventually forced Guinness to remove the category, recognizing that ranking murderers risked sensationalizing atrocity and feeding into the very notoriety that killers like López sought. Media coverage framed López as both a symbol of evil and a grim indictment of weak institutions. He was compared to infamous killers such as Ted Bundy in the United States, André Chikatilo in the Soviet Union, and later Luis Alfredo Garavito in Colombia. Yet his case was distinct because of the extraordinary leniency of his sentence and the mystery of his fate. Where Bundy was executed and Chikatilo shot, López walked free, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and unhealed wounds. In Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru, families of the victims were left with little sense of closure. and their grief was compounded by the knowledge that justice had not been served in proportion to the scale of their loss. The case became more than the story of one man's crimes. It exposed the fragility of legal systems unprepared for atrocity, the failure of international cooperation in handling cross-border violence, and the ethical pitfalls of media sensationalism. López had exploited institutional weaknesses and cultural blind spots, and his trial and sentencing demonstrated just how ill-equipped nations were to deliver justice in the face of crimes that shocked the human conscience. The release of Pedro Alonso López in 1994 and his disappearance after 1998 left an open wound across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. For the families of victims, the knowledge that the man who had confessed to killing their daughters was once again free was unbearable. The uncertainty surrounding his fate deepened this trauma. Unlike other notorious killers whose stories ended in execution or lifelong imprisonment, López slipped into the shadows, and no verifiable sighting has been made in more than 2 decades. The absence of closure meant that communities across the Andes continued to live with the unsettling possibility that he remained alive, anonymous, and unpunished. In Ecuador, the López case exposed the inadequacy of the penal code and forced national reflection on the purpose of sentencing. How could a system that claimed to uphold justice allow a man responsible for more than 100 murders to serve less time than many petty criminals? The maximum sentence of 16 years, rooted in a rehabilitative philosophy, and Ecuador's rejection of capital punishment, had proven grotesquely out of step with the reality of mass homicide. Over time, reforms were introduced. Laws were adjusted to permit harsher sentences for aggravated crimes, particularly those involving children, and debates about the balance between rehabilitation and retribution gained urgency. Although these reforms did not retroactively affect López, they were shaped in part by the recognition that his case had revealed a catastrophic gap in Ecuador's approach to justice. Colombia, too, was forced to confront its failures. López's return there after his deportation from Ecuador ended in farce when he was declared unfit for trial, institutionalized briefly, then released on bail. His disappearance underscored the country's lack of mechanisms for monitoring high-risk offenders and the fragility of its legal system in a period already strained by conflict and criminality. Peru, where López's spree had begun, remembered the moment when villagers caught him and chose mercy over justice by expelling him. That decision became emblematic of the dangers of displacement. By simply passing a predator along rather than confronting his crimes, the state had effectively guaranteed that other children in neighboring nations would die. Beyond individual countries, López's crimes had international implications. They exposed the fatal weaknesses of borders in the fight against transnational crime. During the 1970s, there were no coordinated systems for sharing data on missing children between Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. A girl who vanished in one country might never appear in the records of another. López exploited these blind spots, committing crimes in one jurisdiction before crossing a border and beginning again. In the decades that followed, Interpol expanded its databases, and bilateral agreements between Andean states increased information sharing. Though these reforms came too late for López's victims, they marked a recognition that predatory violence demanded regional cooperation. The memory of the victims themselves became a central part of the legacy. For too long, they had been reduced to numbers, their individuality lost in the headlines that focused on López's boasts of hundreds of deaths. In Ambato and other towns, families and activists sought to reclaim their daughters' stories. Journalists began publishing testimonies from relatives, while communities created small memorials in churches and markets. These acts of remembrance were not only about honoring the dead, but about resisting the erasure that came from treating them as statistics. In this way, the victims were restored as daughters, sisters, and classmates, rather than anonymous figures in a killer's narrative. Ethical debates soon arose around how López should be remembered. Was it right to repeat his nickname, the Monster of the Andes, when doing so risked elevating him to a mythic figure? Should media outlets report the inflated numbers he claimed, or should they restrict themselves to the confirmed 110 murders? These questions revealed a tension between the need to expose the truth of his crimes and the danger of sensationalizing them. The Guinness World Records controversy symbolized this dilemma. By briefly listing López as the world's most prolific serial killer, Guinness turned atrocity into spectacle, only to later reverse course and abandon the category altogether. The lesson was clear. Documenting crimes must be done in a way that respects victims and avoids granting killers the notoriety they crave. Perhaps the most important reform López's crimes inspired lay in the realm of child protection. NGOs, churches, and governments across Latin America began to advocate for better reporting mechanisms, public awareness campaigns, and greater vigilance in schools and markets. Communities developed informal patrols to accompany children, and public service announcements urged families to report disappearances immediately. The idea that every missing child mattered, regardless of class, ethnicity, or geography, gained momentum, though the change was uneven and often resisted by entrenched systems. Even so, the López case became a rallying cry for activists pushing to prioritize the safety of the most vulnerable. The aftermath of López's crimes is therefore a story not only of horror, but of reform and remembrance. It is a story of how communities, once abandoned by their institutions, demanded that those institutions change. It is a story of how families, denied justice in the courts, turned to memory and testimony to honor their daughters. And it is a story of how the Andes, scarred by one man's crimes, slowly rebuilt mechanisms of protection while never forgetting the lives that were lost. The case of Pedro Alonso López has long fascinated criminologists because it stands at the intersection of individual pathology and structural weakness. Unlike many serial killers whose activities remain confined to a single country, López moved fluidly across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, exploiting the blind spots created by national borders. His transnational mobility placed him in a rare category of offenders who operate beyond the reach of fragmented justice systems. When placed alongside other infamous figures such as Ted Bundy in the United States, André Chikatilo in the Soviet Union, or Luis Alfredo Garavito in Colombia, López's uniqueness becomes clear. Bundy's murders spanned multiple U.S. states, and for a time, he evaded detection by exploiting jurisdictional boundaries. But the American system eventually coordinated to secure his conviction and execution. Chikatilo terrorized Soviet Ukraine, yet the centralized state eventually captured and executed him after extensive forensic investigation. Garavito, who emerged in the 1990s, preyed on boys across Colombia, amassing one of the highest victim counts ever recorded. But he was tried and sentenced within a system that had already learned from López's precedent. By contrast, López's crimes cut across 3 national borders at a time when cooperation between Andean states was virtually non-existent, allowing him to slip through gaps that others could not. The Andean region of the late 1970s was fertile ground for his crimes because it combined pervasive poverty with weak institutional capacity. His victims were not chosen at random, but were overwhelmingly poor, indigenous girls whose disappearances rarely commanded urgent police attention. To the state, these were children at the margins, invisible in life and too easily dismissed in death. Law enforcement agencies were underfunded, uncoordinated, and ill-prepared to recognize patterns of disappearance across time and geography. Borders created further protection for López. A child who vanished in Peru would not be entered into Colombian records, and Ecuadorian police would have no reason to suspect a stranger passing through their towns of being linked to disappearances elsewhere. In this way, López used geography and institutional fragmentation as weapons, building impunity from the absence of coordination. Psychologically, López displayed traits that criminologists recognize as common among serial predators. His confessions were marked by boastfulness and a desire for recognition, consistent with the egotism of many offenders who inflate their victim counts to magnify their sense of power. Yet his ability to direct investigators to specific graves suggested that his claims were not wholly fabricated. Unlike fantasists who confessed to crimes they never committed, López possessed operational knowledge of burial sites that corroborated his accounts. This combination of verifiable evidence and exaggerated boasting complicates his profile. He was both a sadistic killer driven by compulsion and a man who sought infamy, relishing the spectacle of his own notoriety. When contrasted with Garavito, López highlights both continuity and change in Colombian criminal history. Both men targeted vulnerable children, exploiting the same structural neglect of marginalized communities, yet their outcomes diverged. López served 14 years in Ecuador and vanished, while Garavito was sentenced to decades in prison. His incarceration continually extended to ensure he would not be released. The difference reflected incremental strengthening of legal frameworks and forensic capabilities by the 1990s. In this way, López became the grim example that Colombia and other nations looked back upon when reforming their systems. From a broader criminological perspective, López demonstrates the limits of justice systems designed to address individual crimes when confronted with atrocity-level seriality. Courts are accustomed to charging single offenses, or even a handful, but they falter when one man is implicated in hundreds. In Ecuador, prosecutors did not attempt to try him for each murder individually because the sentence would not change. The maximum was already fixed at 16 years. Families were thus denied the recognition that each life lost was worthy of its own trial and its own justice. López's case reveals how the very structure of the law can erase individuality, collapsing hundreds of murders into a single sentence and leaving families to grieve without official acknowledgement of their daughter's unique story. The lessons drawn from López extend beyond Latin America. His crimes underscore the importance of centralized data on missing persons, the necessity of international cooperation, and the imperative to treat every disappearance as urgent, particularly when the victims belong to marginalized groups. His story is a stark reminder that serial killers do not emerge in a vacuum. They flourish in the spaces where states are weak, where poverty silences victims, and where institutions fail to see the patterns until it is far too late. For the families of López's victims, the aftermath of his crimes was defined not only by grief, but by the absence of institutional recognition. Each of the 110 confirmed victims in Ecuador left behind parents, siblings, and communities forced to reckon with loss that could not be repaired. Many of these families were poor and indigenous, already marginalized within their societies, and when their daughters disappeared, their pleas were often ignored or dismissed by the authorities. After López's arrest, they received neither compensation nor systematic counseling, and the state offered little by way of meaningful support. Their mourning was largely carried out in private, though in towns like Ambato it also became a communal experience, expressed through vigils, church services, and the shared vigilance of neighbors who had themselves played a decisive role in his capture. Ambato, in particular, bore the brunt of the tragedy and the notoriety. It was here that López's crimes were revealed, and it was here that the marketplace vendors intervened to stop him. The city became known internationally less for its commerce or culture than as the place where the monster of the Andes was unmasked. For many residents, this association was a source of both pain and pride. Pain because the memory of the victims weighed heavily on their identity, and pride because it was their vigilance that had brought an end to his spree. The community became both a symbol of horror and an example of how ordinary citizens could step in where institutions had failed. In the years that followed, a great frustration among families was the invisibility of the victims in the international narrative. Media coverage frequently focused on López himself, his boasts, and the sheer scale of his crimes, while the children he murdered were reduced to numbers. Activists and journalists attempted to correct this imbalance by publishing testimonies, naming victims where possible, and preserving family memories. In doing so, they sought to restore individuality to the girls who had been swallowed up by the anonymity of statistics. These efforts were modest compared to the enormity of the loss, but they signaled a growing recognition that the story of López was not just about the man, but about the children and families whose lives were shattered. The case also prompted reforms in the handling of missing child cases, though these unfolded unevenly across the Andes. Ecuador gradually introduced child protection units within its police force and attempted to create more reliable systems for reporting and tracking disappearances. Colombia, spurred further by later cases such as Garavito's, began expanding hotlines and centralized registries in the 1990s. Peru, slower to change, eventually began incorporating categories for missing children into police records, though enforcement remained inconsistent. These reforms reflected the lesson that disappearances of children could not be treated as routine matters, and that urgent, coordinated responses were essential to prevent predators from exploiting systemic neglect. At the community level, grassroots responses emerged long before institutional reforms took hold. Parents organized patrols to escort children to school and keep watch in markets. Churches offered counseling and raised awareness, and NGOs developed programs to educate families about the dangers of child abduction. These efforts reflected both resilience and distrust. Families knew that the state could not always be relied upon, and so they took responsibility for safeguarding their children. Over time, these practices became ingrained in everyday life, ensuring that López's crimes, while devastating, also generated practical lessons about vigilance. Remembering the victims became an act of prevention as well as mourning. In Ecuadorian towns, stories of the missing girls were told not only as remembrances, but as warnings to new generations. Teachers and parents reminded children that predators existed, and that they had to exercise caution in public spaces. This form of cultural memory was not about instilling paranoia, but about embedding awareness. In this way, the lives lost became a kind of protective legacy, shaping communal practices so that such atrocities might never be repeated. The López case also left a cultural imprint in literature, media, and folklore. Documentaries, novels, and later podcasts drew on his story, sometimes with sensitivity, sometimes with sensationalism. Families often resented portrayals that turned him into a figure of fascination while failing to honor the victims. Yet others argued that the cultural retellings, however flawed, ensured that the crimes would not be forgotten. In this tension lies the paradox of memory. Remembering is painful, but forgetting risks erasure. Perhaps the deepest wound of all is the incompleteness of the story. While Ecuador confirmed 110 murders, López claimed hundreds more across Colombia and Peru, and many families in those countries continue to wonder whether their daughters were among his victims, without remains, without closure. their grief remains unresolved. In this sense, Lopez haunts not only through the crimes he committed, but through the silence that surrounds so many others. His absence from justice is mirrored by the absence of the girls who were never found, and it is this unfinished grief that ensures his shadow lingers across the Andes. From the moment Pedro Alonso López began to speak about his crimes, there was a problem that has continued to shadow his legacy: the difficulty of separating fact from self-serving myth. His confessions, while chilling, contained both verifiable detail and wild exaggeration. Investigators in Ecuador were able to confirm his responsibility for 110 murders, linking him to specific remains and belongings discovered in burial sites he identified. Beyond that, however, his claim of more than 300 victims has never been conclusively proven. The danger of taking his word at face value lies in the knowledge that serial offenders often embellish their numbers, seeking to magnify their sense of power. For Lopez, boasting of hundreds of deaths was a way to establish himself as a figure of unparalleled notoriety, the man of the century, as he once described himself. The international press eagerly seized on his claims. Headlines shouted figures of 300, sometimes even more, repeating them as fact without pausing to distinguish between what was confirmed and what was speculative. This sensational framing, while effective in capturing attention, came at a cost. It allowed Lopez to achieve the infamy he craved, turning him into a figure of morbid fascination. It also reduced the victims to statistics, eclipsing their individuality in favor of a number that grew ever larger with each retelling. The nuance that 110 murders were confirmed and the rest unverified was lost in the rush to shock readers. The Guinness World Records controversy exemplified the dangers of such reporting. For a time, Lopez appeared in its pages as the world's most prolific serial killer, based not on judicial findings, but on his own boasts. Families of victims and ethicists were horrified. To transform atrocity into a kind of record book entry risked trivializing suffering and granting Lopez exactly what he desired: international recognition. Eventually, Guinness removed the category entirely, acknowledging that it had made a mistake by treating mass murder as something quantifiable and rankable. Yet the damage had been done, and Lopez's myth continued to circulate, bolstered by the credibility that Guinness's imprimatur briefly conferred. Part of the difficulty in establishing the truth lies in the fragmentary nature of records across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru in the 1970s. In Colombia, disappearances were often obscured by the fog of armed conflict and rural displacement. Families who reported missing daughters were met with indifference or the suggestion that their children had simply run away. In Peru, where Lopez's spree began, his expulsion meant that cases linked to him were never investigated thoroughly. Only in Ecuador, where floods and community vigilance forced authorities to act, was a systematic investigation carried out. Even there, the record-keeping was incomplete, and many files were later lost or scattered. Without modern forensic tools, investigators had to rely on circumstantial evidence, leaving countless questions unanswered. The way Lopez has been remembered in popular culture further complicates matters. Documentaries, novels, and podcasts have turned his story into a narrative that often blurs the line between fact and dramatization. Some portray him as a cunning, almost supernatural figure who evaded capture for years, when in reality, his downfall came not through police brilliance, but through chance and community action. Others amplify the scale of his crimes beyond reason, inflating the numbers to mythical proportions. In doing so, they obscure the structural factors, poverty, neglect, weak institutions, that enabled him, choosing instead to frame him as a monster who appeared inexplicably from the shadows. The term Monster of the Andes itself illustrates the problem. On one level, it captures the horror that communities felt at his crimes, marking him as a figure whose actions were beyond comprehension. On another level, it risks dehumanizing him in a way that obscures accountability. López was not a supernatural being. He was a man who exploited systemic vulnerabilities. To call him a monster may provide psychological comfort by setting him apart from humanity. But it also suggests that nothing could have been done to prevent him. In reality, stronger institutions, better communication between states, and a more urgent response to missing children could have stopped him years earlier. For scholars and journalists, the López case has become an object lesson in responsible reporting. It demands accuracy over exaggeration, a focus on the victims rather than the perpetrator, and an awareness of how narratives shape public understanding. The temptation to inflate numbers or lean into myth is strong, but to do so risks honoring the killer's ego rather than the memory of the children he destroyed. The challenge, then, is to remember López truthfully, not as the mythical figure he fashioned himself into, but as a deeply human criminal who thrived in conditions that should never have existed. The arrest and conviction of Pedro Alonso López left behind a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate horror of his crimes. For Ecuador, his case exposed weaknesses in its justice system that could no longer be ignored. The sentencing of López to just 16 years, the maximum penalty permitted at the time, revealed a law utterly incapable of addressing atrocity-level crimes. The revelation that one man could murder more than 100 children and face less than 2 decades in prison shocked the conscience of the nation. Over time, the penal code was revised, allowing harsher sentences for aggravated crimes and offering greater protection for minors. These reforms were born directly from the recognition that the López case had revealed catastrophic gaps in the legal framework. Ecuador also learned a painful lesson about the importance of community vigilance. López was not captured by a sweeping police investigation, but by ordinary market vendors in Ambato, who saw him attempting to abduct a child. This fact became both an indictment of the state and a source of pride for the community. It demonstrated how ordinary citizens, motivated by instinct and courage, could achieve what institutions had failed to do. Ambato became a symbol of vigilance, remembered as the place where the horror was exposed, but also where ordinary people intervened to protect the vulnerable. Colombia, López's homeland, faced its own reckoning. When he was deported there in 1994, authorities failed to mount a successful prosecution. Instead, he was briefly institutionalized before being released on bail, a decision that allowed him to vanish. This failure mirrored earlier neglect and foreshadowed the devastation that would follow in the 1990s with the case of Luis Alfredo Garavito. Garavito's arrest in 1999 finally forced Colombia to implement sweeping reforms: the creation of centralized databases for missing children, the expansion of forensic services, and the establishment of specialized police units dedicated to child protection. Many criminologists argue that the lessons learned from López were ignored until Garavito forced them into the open, making López both a warning and a grim precedent. Peru, the country where López's spree began, remembered him chiefly as a missed opportunity. Villagers in Ayacucho had caught him in the act years earlier, and instead of prosecuting him, authorities expelled him. That decision has been cited ever since as a textbook example of how not to respond to predatory violence. Expulsion simply displaced the danger, moving it from one country to another. In later decades, Peru reformed its laws on crimes against minors, recognizing that offenders could not simply be passed along. The López case became a cautionary tale in policy discussions about why crimes against children demand prosecution, not exile. Regionally, López's transnational crimes highlighted the urgent need for cooperation between nations. His ability to exploit borders revealed that missing child cases could not be handled solely within the framework of one country. By the 1990s and 2000s, Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru began working more closely with Interpol, sharing intelligence and creating bilateral agreements to monitor offenders and track disappearances. These reforms, while imperfect, marked a turning point in recognizing that predators like López operated in the gaps between states, and that only cooperation could close those gaps. Beyond legal and institutional reforms, López's crimes also reshaped social awareness of child safety. Families across the Andes became more vigilant. Schools began organizing escorts for students, and public campaigns emphasized the dangers of speaking with strangers. NGOs and churches amplified these efforts, spreading awareness and training communities to protect children in public spaces. In this way, López's shadow became a catalyst for change, transforming grief into vigilance. Yet his disappearance after 1998 has ensured that unease never entirely faded. For many families and communities, the lack of closure sustains a lingering anxiety. López is remembered as much for his crimes as for the fact that justice was left unfinished, and this unresolved fate continues to haunt the Andes. His story has become both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder of the cost of institutional weakness, but also a lesson in the power of vigilance and reform. The way Pedro Alonso López is remembered today reflects an uneasy balance between the horror of his crimes, the invisibility of his victims, and the ethical dilemmas faced by those who tell his story. In much of the international press and true crime media, López himself has remained the central figure. He is invoked as the monster of the Andes, a label that captures the scale of his atrocities, but risks granting him the very infamy he desired. By contrast, the victims, most of them poor and indigenous girls, have remained largely anonymous, reduced to statistics and headlines that repeat figures of 110 confirmed or 300 claimed. Sanctity. The imbalance in this narrative has long troubled families and victim advocates, who argue that remembrance should focus on the children and their communities rather than on the killer. The nickname itself illustrates the tension between accuracy and myth. To call López a monster expresses the revulsion and fear his crimes inspired, yet it also risks placing him outside of humanity, as though he were a supernatural aberration, rather than a man who thrived in the cracks of weak institutions and neglected communities. The danger in such framing is that it suggests nothing could have been done to prevent him, when in fact his crimes were made possible by systemic failures, poor policing, fragmented borders, and the invisibility of marginalized children. To cast him as a mythic figure risks obscuring the social realities that allowed him to operate for so long. Cultural representations have only amplified this problem. López has appeared in documentaries, true crime anthologies, podcasts, and even fictionalized accounts that blend fact with dramatization. Some portrayals emphasize the grotesque scale of his confessed crimes, repeating his claim of 300 victims as though it were settled truth. Others dramatize his persona, presenting him as a cunning predator who outwitted authorities at every turn. Such portrayals tend to obscure the real story, which is that López was captured not by brilliant police work, but by chance and community action. They also risk erasing the structural issues, poverty, displacement, neglect, that were as much a part of the tragedy as López himself. One of the most controversial moments in the cultural representation of López came when Guinness World Records briefly listed him as the most prolific serial killer. The decision provoked outrage from families, ethicists, and human rights advocates who argued that such recognition trivialized atrocity and granted López the fame he craved. Guinness ultimately removed the category, acknowledging that transforming murder into a kind of record book competition was both dangerous and unethical. Yet the controversy reinforced the difficulty of documenting López's crimes in ways that inform rather than sensationalize. The way López is remembered also varies across regions. In Ecuador, Ambato is remembered as the place where he was finally caught, and local narratives often emphasize the courage of the market vendors who subdued him, keeping the focus on community action rather than on López himself. In Colombia, where he was born, memory is fragmented, and he is overshadowed by later predators, such as Garavito, though criminologists still cite him as an early warning ignored by the state. In Peru, his presence is recalled as a moment of institutional failure. The villagers who caught him were denied justice when authorities chose expulsion over prosecution. Internationally, however, López is remembered less for these local dynamics than for the shocking scale of his crimes and the scandal of his short sentence. The ethical imperatives for scholars, journalists, and storytellers are clear but difficult to uphold. They must distinguish between confirmed facts and unverified claims, resist the temptation to inflate numbers, and center the victims rather than the perpetrator. They must also emphasize the systemic factors that enabled his crimes, lest the narrative reduce him to a mythical figure who descended upon the Andes in isolation. Only by doing so can remembrance serve justice rather than spectacle. And yet, despite the risks, López has become a figure of collective trauma in the Andes, invoked not only as a historical criminal, but as a cultural warning. Parents still caution their children with his name, reminding them not to trust strangers in markets or bus stations. His story has become part of the region's folk memory, functioning as both a wound and a shield, a scar that cannot be forgotten, and a lesson passed on to guard against future harm. In the years since his arrest and release, the case of Pedro Alonso López has become an enduring point of reference in criminology and legal debates around the world. His crimes place him in a category few others occupy, a serial killer whose confirmed victims numbered in the hundreds, whose spree crossed multiple national borders, and whose punishment fell shockingly short of reflecting the gravity of his acts. For criminologists, López is a case study not only in predatory behavior, but in the structural failures that allowed such behavior to flourish. His story underscores the fact that serial killers are not confined to industrialized nations or to the sensationalized landscapes of American or European crime dramas. They emerge wherever poverty, displacement, and weak institutions combine to leave victims unprotected and predators unchecked. His sentencing in Ecuador highlighted the inadequacy of statutory maximums in the face of extraordinary crime. 16 years, later reduced to 14 for good behavior, was the same penalty a man might face for a single homicide. The fact that López's sentence was capped, despite the enormity of his confirmed murders, forced jurists and legislators to question whether maximum penalties should exist at all in cases of serial violence. It also raised broader philosophical questions about the purpose of punishment. Was the goal to rehabilitate, to deter, or to exact retribution on behalf of society? López's own behavior in prison complicated the issue further. By all accounts, he was a calm and compliant inmate, described as a model prisoner. Yet this outward performance did not reflect remorse or transformation. Instead, it illustrated the manipulative adaptability of a psychopath, one who could mask his nature long enough to secure release. The debate over whether rehabilitation is possible for someone who has murdered hundreds of children remains unresolved. Some argue that all human beings deserve the chance to change, and that prison should serve as a space for reform rather than simply retribution. Others counter that crimes of such magnitude sever the social contract irreparably, leaving lifelong incarceration as the only just response. Still others take a utilitarian approach, insisting that public safety demands incapacitation regardless of questions of redemption. López's release, followed by his disappearance, seemed to vindicate the latter position. Even the possibility of reoffense was intolerable in light of his past. His case, therefore, remains a touchstone in debates about whether rehabilitation should have limits when confronted with atrocity-level crime. Comparisons with Luis Alfredo Garavito sharpen these questions. When Garavito was convicted in Colombia in 1999, the courts imposed a sentence of 40 years, later extended to 60. Though still criticized as inadequate given his hundreds of victims, Garavito's sentence reflected a legal system that had adapted in response to the failures evident in López's case. Where López was allowed to vanish after serving little more than a decade, Garavito was kept under custody with no realistic prospect of freedom. The difference demonstrates that López's legacy, though bitter, did contribute to change. His case became the example of what must never be repeated. Yet even as sentencing frameworks evolved, López's crimes revealed something deeper: the inadequacy of traditional legal categories to process mass serial murder. Courts are designed to handle individual crimes, or even multiple crimes committed by one person, but they falter when confronted with hundreds. Prosecutors in Ecuador did not attempt to charge López separately for each murder, because the sentence would not change. In doing so, they collapsed the individuality of victims into a single case file, erasing the possibility of individualized justice. For families, this was a second violation. Not only had they lost their daughters, but the state had denied them recognition of their daughters' uniqueness in the eyes of the law. The international community took note of these failings, and López's case was cited in debates about whether certain crimes should fall under universal jurisdiction, allowing any country to prosecute them, regardless of where they occurred. Advocates argued that mass child murder constituted an atrocity comparable in scale to crimes against humanity, deserving of extraordinary legal treatment. Although such proposals never advanced into binding frameworks, the debates underscored how López's crimes had stretched the imagination of justice to its limits. For the families of victims, however, these abstract debates brought little comfort. They lived with the knowledge that López had walked free after only 14 years, and that the man who had confessed to destroying their children's lives was never truly held accountable. For them, justice remained forever denied. Their grief compounded by the sense that the institutions meant to protect them had failed completely. The story of López thus forces a reckoning with an uncomfortable truth. Justice, as societies conceive it, is often incapable of keeping pace with the scale of human cruelty. Although decades have passed since his arrest, the story of Pedro Alonso López continues to circulate throughout the Andean region, not as a closed chapter, but as a living cautionary tale. His name remains a warning spoken by parents to their children in markets and schools. Do not wander away. Do not trust strangers. Remember the monster of the Andes. This persistence of his memory reflects not only the scale of his crimes, but also the unresolved nature of his fate. Because López disappeared after his release in Colombia in 1998, never to be seen again with certainty, he exists in public imagination as both a ghost and a possibility. The absence of closure sustains the anxiety that he might have continued killing, or at the very least, that he never faced the accountability his crimes demanded. For the families of victims, the trauma of López's crimes did not end with his imprisonment, nor even with his release. Many parents never recovered their daughters' remains, while others had to identify scraps of clothing or belongings as the only confirmation of death. Each family carried grief in isolation, but collectively they bore the scars of a society that had failed them. That grief often transmitted itself to the next generation. Siblings grew up in households marked by silence, anger, or mistrust of authorities. Grandchildren inherited the stories of fear and loss, learning from a young age that their family had been touched by a predator who slipped through the cracks of justice. In this way, Lopez's violence became not just an event in the past, but a form of intergenerational trauma that shaped identity and memory. Across the Andes, Lopez came to symbolize state failure. In Ecuador, his sentencing was seen as proof that the law could not respond proportionately to atrocity. In Colombia, his release after psychiatric custody showed that the institutions of justice were either unwilling or unable to contain him. In Peru, the decision to expel him instead of prosecuting him became a lasting stain on the authorities who allowed him to continue killing elsewhere. In all three countries, his name came to represent not merely one man's evil, but the abandonment of vulnerable citizens by the very institutions meant to protect them. The central wound of his legacy lies in the sense that justice was never achieved. Ecuadorian families saw him serve only 14 years for more than 100 confirmed murders, a punishment so small as to feel meaningless. Colombian families endured the indignity of watching him walk free under the pretext of psychiatric evaluation, knowing full well that he had confessed to atrocities. Peruvian families were left without trials or even investigations. This absence of justice compounded the pain of loss, creating not only grief but bitterness, a sense that the system had valued bureaucracy and procedure over the lives of children. Yet from this despair, communities forged lessons in vigilance. Parents began to insist on accompanying their children everywhere, while teachers and churches reinforced the message that children must be wary of strangers. Stories of Lopez became part of everyday pedagogy, not simply as tales of horror, but as practical warnings. Generations of Andean children grew up learning that danger could lurk in seemingly ordinary places: a marketplace stall, a bus stop, a roadside. This protective inheritance reflected both trauma and resilience. Families turned their grief into a form of prevention, ensuring that the memory of loss also functioned as a shield. Over time, Lopez also entered the cultural identity of the Andes, not as a figure to be celebrated, but as a shared scar. His crimes became a negative heritage, shaping how communities saw themselves and their governments. In literature, journalism, and even local folklore, his name appeared as shorthand for ultimate evil, invoked in debates about missing children or government neglect. Though deeply painful, this collective memory fostered solidarity among victims' families, linking communities across borders who might otherwise have remained strangers. The paradox of Lopez's modern legacy is that remembering him is both necessary and dangerous. To forget would dishonor the victims and allow the lessons of history to be lost. But to remember risks granting him the notoriety he sought, elevating his story above those of the children whose lives he destroyed. Andean societies have sought to resolve this paradox by remembering through the victims, telling their stories, and passing on lessons of vigilance, while refusing to glorify Lopez himself. In this balance lies the enduring legacy of a man whose crimes shattered families, reshaped communities, and left wounds that time has not healed. The case of Pedro Alonso López has never been confined to the Andean nations where he committed his crimes. From the moment his story entered the international press, it became a subject of study for criminologists, sociologists, policymakers, and ethicists across the world. In classrooms and research journals, Lopez is held up as an unsettling reminder of what can happen when structural weakness meets predatory intent. His life and crimes are now used to train future generations of lawyers, criminologists, and social workers, not only as an example of pathology, but as a demonstration of how institutions themselves can fail. For criminology, López provides an essential case study of transnational serial homicide. Unlike the familiar narratives of killers confined to one city or one nation, López drifted across borders, targeting the most vulnerable with impunity. His mobility illustrated the danger of fragmented policing systems and the absence of centralized data on missing children. At the same time, his victim profile revealed the importance of structural inequality. He preyed on the poor, the displaced, and the indigenous, children whose disappearances were not treated with urgency by the authorities. Criminologists studying his case emphasize that serial crime does not emerge in isolation, but is shaped by the broader environment of neglect and poverty. Sociologists, meanwhile, point to López as evidence of how social invisibility and marginalization intersect with violence. The girls he targeted were vulnerable, not only because of their age, but because of their position at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Their poverty made them less visible to institutions, and their indigenous identity often meant their families lacked the influence or resources to demand action. From this perspective, López's spree was as much about systemic invisibility as it was about his individual pathology. Communities responded, of course, with vigilance and resistance, but the fact that ordinary citizens were the ones to capture him in Ambato illustrates how state neglect left families to fend for themselves. Political scientists draw lessons from his case about governance and state legitimacy. The fact that López was expelled from Peru, ignored in Colombia, and inadequately sentenced in Ecuador illustrates the fragility of justice systems in the Andes at the time. These failures weakened trust in institutions and highlighted how states lose legitimacy when they cannot provide basic protection to their citizens. In policy discussions, López is invoked as a symbol of what happens when governments lack both capacity and coordination. The eventual reforms in cross-border cooperation, forensic services, and sentencing laws were born out of this recognition, though they came decades too late for his victims. At the global level, child protection advocates have often cited López as a case that demonstrates why missing children must be treated as emergencies rather than routine matters. His crimes revealed how predators exploit the time lost between a disappearance and an investigation, and they underscored the need for rapid response mechanisms like alert systems and international databases. Interpol's later emphasis on missing child coordination drew, in part, from the recognition that López had operated in the blind spots of fragmented systems. His story became a call for international cooperation, showing that crimes against children were not merely local tragedies, but matters of global concern. The scholarly relevance of López also extends into comparative criminology. For years, the study of serial killers was dominated by Western cases: Bundy in the United States, Chikatilo in the Soviet Union, Sutcliffe in England. López and later Garavito forced the discipline to expand its gaze, acknowledging that serial predation is global and shaped by its environment. In the Andes, weak institutions and poverty amplified the scale of crimes in ways that differed from industrialized nations. By examining López, criminologists could no longer cling to narrow Western frameworks. They had to account for the global diversity of conditions in which serial violence emerges. Philosophers and ethicists, too, turned to López's story when considering how justice systems should respond to atrocity-level crimes committed by individuals. His confirmed murders rival the scale of war crimes or acts of terrorism. Yet he was processed through an ordinary criminal court, sentenced under an ordinary penal code, and released like any other prisoner. This mismatch between scale and response raises questions about whether crimes of this magnitude require special frameworks, perhaps akin to those applied to genocide or crimes against humanity. López thus became a reference point in debates about the very limits of justice in liberal societies. Finally, his case has become a pedagogical tool across disciplines. Law students analyze the failures of sentencing frameworks. Sociology students examine the invisibility of marginalized victims. Psychology students dissect his confessions and manipulations. And journalism students are taught to avoid the sensationalism that has too often marked his coverage. By crossing disciplinary lines, López has become more than a case study in horror. He has become a curriculum in how societies confront, process, and attempt to learn from extreme violence. Even though Pedro Alonso López committed his crimes more than 4 decades ago, his story continues to shape debates about how societies protect children and prevent similar atrocities. Policymakers often look back at the scale of his spree and the ease with which he evaded capture as the nightmare scenario that modern systems must be designed to prevent. His ability to operate unnoticed across 3 countries has become a cautionary example invoked whenever governments consider reforms to missing child alerts, surveillance of high-risk offenders, and cross-border cooperation. One of the most glaring weaknesses his case exposed was the absence of rapid response mechanisms for missing children. In the late 1970s, disappearances in the Andes were often filed as routine police matters, treated with little urgency and rarely coordinated across jurisdictions. Families could report a child missing only to be told to wait, as though the child had wandered off and would soon return. López thrived in this delay. Today, many Latin American countries have developed systems modeled on the U.S. Amber Alert, creating hotlines, integrated databases, and emergency broadcast protocols designed to treat every missing child as a potential emergency. These systems arose in part because López had shown what could happen when disappearances were dismissed as ordinary. His case also highlighted the dangers of releasing high-risk offenders without monitoring. When Ecuador deported him to Colombia in 1994, he was briefly placed in psychiatric custody, declared sane, and then released on bail. The absence of any system to track him allowed him to disappear. This failure has since fueled debates about whether serial offenders should be subjected to lifetime monitoring, whether through electronic bracelets, mandatory reporting, or international registries, accessible across borders. Advocates argue that if such mechanisms had existed, López could never have vanished. Opponents worry about the potential abuse of surveillance technologies and the risk of eroding civil liberties. The balance between public safety and individual rights lies at the heart of these debates. López's case pushes the question to its extreme. If a man responsible for more than 100 confirmed murders can vanish into obscurity, does not society have a duty to impose the strictest possible controls? For many, the answer is yes. Yet civil libertarians warn that policies created in response to monsters can quickly expand beyond their original scope, ensnaring offenders who pose far less risk or enabling governments to misuse surveillance powers. The shadow of López therefore hangs over contemporary discussions, not only as a justification for stronger protections, but also as a reminder of the dangers of overreach. Technology has transformed the possibilities of prevention since López's era. Biometric databases, DNA testing, and facial recognition systems now allow police to track identities and identify remains with a precision unimaginable in the 1970s. These tools might have linked López to cases across borders far earlier, yet technology alone is not enough. His crimes were possible not only because of weak tools, but because of a cultural and institutional failure to value the lives of poor and indigenous children. Without a commitment to treating every disappearance as urgent, the most sophisticated databases cannot prevent tragedies. In modern policy debates, López is often invoked in counterfactual terms. What if Peru had prosecuted him instead of expelling him? What if Ecuador had stronger sentencing laws? What if Colombia had monitored him after release? These what-ifs have been transformed into reforms. Countries now impose longer sentences for serial crimes, require offender registries, and create cross-border alerts. López has thus become not only a historical figure, but also a benchmark against which governments measure their own vigilance. His story remains a grim reminder of the stakes in debates about surveillance and civil liberties. On one side lies the duty to prevent another López, to ensure that no predator can exploit systemic weakness to destroy hundreds of lives. On the other lies the responsibility to safeguard rights and prevent technologies designed for monsters from being turned against ordinary citizens. That balance has no easy answer, but the memory of López ensures that societies cannot afford complacency. His absence from justice continues to haunt the Andes, and his crimes continue to influence how nations everywhere think about protecting the vulnerable. Over time, Pedro Alonso López has ceased to exist only as a historical criminal and has entered the realm of cultural symbol. In the towns and villages of the Andes, his name has become part of oral tradition, invoked not just in news reports or academic studies, but in the stories parents tell their children. He has taken on the qualities of a modern bogeyman, a figure cited to instill caution. Children are warned not to stray too far in markets, not to speak to strangers, lest the monster of the Andes find them. This transformation from man into folklore reflects the way societies process trauma. Real-world horror, when too vast to comprehend, often seeps into myth, where it can serve as both a warning and a protective tale. Psychologically, López has become an archetype of evil in Andean memory. Communities place him alongside figures of traditional folklore, such as El Coco, the bogeyman who steals away children, or predatory demons in indigenous mythologies. Just as Jack the Ripper became a symbol of menace in London, López has come to embody the incomprehensible threat in South America, the living proof that darkness can emerge not from legend, but from flesh and blood. By casting him as archetypal evil, society has created a narrative framework through which fear can be transmitted and understood, a way to make sense of the incomprehensible. That fear has become a cultural inheritance, passed down from one generation to the next. Children who grew up in the 1980s hearing of López's crimes later retold the same warnings to their own children, even as the details blurred with time. What remained constant was the lesson: danger exists, vigilance is necessary, and predators may lurk even in familiar spaces. Thus, López's crimes continue to shape behavior long after his disappearance. The legacy of fear, though painful, functions as a form of cultural pedagogy, embedding protective instincts in everyday life. Popular media has contributed to the mythic layer that surrounds López. Documentaries and podcasts recount his story with varying degrees of accuracy, often emphasizing the enormity of his confessed victim count, or dramatizing his ability to elude capture. In doing so, they sometimes exaggerate or distort the historical record, but they also ensure that his crimes remain etched into global consciousness. This mythologizing resembles the ways other societies have remembered their most notorious killers, not only as criminals, but as enduring figures of cultural imagination. The mystery of López's fate, the fact that he vanished rather than being executed or imprisoned for life, adds to the myth, leaving him suspended between history and legend. The psychological impact of his crimes extended beyond folklore. Communities in Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru experienced a profound erosion of trust. Marketplaces and bus stations, once seen as ordinary public spaces, became associated with fear. Parents no longer allowed their children to roam freely, and strangers were viewed with suspicion. This transformation altered daily life in subtle but lasting ways, reshaping social practices around caution and surveillance. The scar left by López was not just in the families of victims, but in the fabric of communal trust itself. Symbolically, López also came to represent state abandonment. In the narratives retold across the Andes, he is remembered not only as a killer, but as someone who thrived because governments failed to act. He is both the embodiment of external evil and the proof of internal neglect. When new cases of missing children arise, commentators and families often invoke López's name as a warning to institutions. This must not be repeated. This time, justice must act before it is too late. The paradox of his symbolic legacy is that myth both preserves and distorts. By remembering him as a monster, communities keep alive the memory of the threat he posed, ensuring vigilance across generations. But myth also risks obscuring the real social conditions that allowed him to operate and blurring the identities of his victims in favor of his legend. Scholars therefore emphasize the need to distinguish between the historical López, a man who exploited systemic failures, and the folkloric López, an archetype of evil who stalks cultural memory. Both figures coexist, each shaping how the Andes remembers, grieves, and warns. The story of Pedro Alonso López, remembered as the monster of the Andes, is one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of crime. Born into poverty and neglect, he transformed into a predator who exploited the vulnerabilities of children and the weaknesses of institutions across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. His arrest in Ambato in 1980 revealed not only the scale of his killings, but also the fragility of the systems that should have protected the most vulnerable. That revelation was compounded by the shocking inadequacy of his punishment. A sentence of 16 years, reduced to 14 for more than 100 confirmed murders. His later release and disappearance left families without closure and societies without justice, a wound that remains open to this day. The victims stand at the heart of this story. They were young girls, poor, indigenous, and invisible in the eyes of the state, until their absence became impossible to ignore. Their lives were reduced to numbers in headlines, their identities eclipsed by the notoriety of the man who took them. Yet to their families and communities, they were daughters, sisters, students, and friends. Remembering them as individuals rather than as statistics is essential to honoring their memory. Their invisibility in life and in death is part of the tragedy, a reminder that structural neglect often sets the stage for violence. Institutionally, López's crimes forced reforms across the Andes. Ecuador revised its penal code to allow harsher sentences for aggravated crimes. Colombia, stung by its failure to monitor López after his release, later developed centralized child protection systems, reforms accelerated by the Garavito case. Peru, haunted by the decision to expel López instead of prosecuting him, eventually strengthened its laws on crimes against minors. On a regional level, his transnational mobility spurred greater cooperation between neighboring states and with Interpol, leading to the creation of cross-border databases for missing children. These reforms, however, arrived only after countless lives had already been lost. The symbolic legacy of López endures in Andean folklore and cultural imagination. He has become a bogeyman figure, a cautionary presence invoked by parents to warn children against trusting strangers. His crimes scarred communities, eroding trust in public spaces and leaving behind a generational inheritance of fear. Yet this memory also became a form of protection. embedding vigilance into the daily lives of families across the region. López thus remains not only a historical figure, but also a cultural one, part of the living memory of the Andes. Globally, López's case reshaped scholarly and policy debates. For criminologists, he demonstrated that serial killers are not confined to wealthy or industrialized societies, but emerge wherever systemic neglect creates opportunities. For sociologists, his crimes revealed how poverty and marginalization determine vulnerability. For philosophers, his case raised questions about whether traditional systems of justice can adequately address crimes of such scale, or whether new frameworks are required for individuals whose violence rivals that of mass atrocity. In journalism and popular culture, his story continues to serve as a lesson in the ethical pitfalls of sensationalizing atrocity. What makes López's story especially haunting is its lack of resolution. Unlike Bundy or Chikatilo, who faced execution, or Garavito, who remained imprisoned, López simply vanished. His disappearance left families without closure, nations without a final accounting, and the world with a lingering unease. In this absence, he became more myth than man, a figure whose shadow continues to stretch across generations. The injustice of his unfinished story is as much a part of his legacy as the murders themselves. The enduring lesson of López's crimes is the absolute necessity of valuing every child, regardless of class, ethnicity, or geography. His victims were invisible precisely because they were poor and indigenous, and it was that invisibility which allowed him to operate for so long. Justice must be capable of scaling to the enormity of atrocity, and institutions must be vigilant against the blind spots that predators exploit. Memory must serve prevention, ensuring that the telling of López's story strengthens the resolve to protect children and to close the gaps that allowed one man to destroy so many lives. In the end, the tale of Pedro Alonso López is more than a chronicle of evil. It is a mirror held up to societies, reflecting the consequences of neglect, the fragility of justice, and the resilience of communities who refuse to remain silent. The children he murdered cannot be brought back, and the justice denied to their families cannot be restored. But their memory endures, carried in the vigilance of the living, in the reforms that followed, and in the cautionary tale that continues to echo across the Andes, a warning born of tragedy, and a reminder of the cost of forgetting.